I have the great pleasure to introduce our next guest, Tino Sehgal. Tino suggested that we do this rather as a conversation. He preferred that format of a conversation, and he's going to explain in a nanosecond why. Tino is an artist based in Berlin. His works, which he calls constructed situations, involve one or more people carrying out instructions conceived by the artist over the entire duration of an exhibition. Sehgal studied political economy and dance in Germany and began to work as an artist in 2000, which is the year we met, and ever since had many, many conversations. So this is not the first interview today. Tino has had 3 exhibitions, 3 solo shows at the ICA in London. He's participated in many, many group shows, Manifesto in Frankfurt, the German Pavilion for the 2005 Venice Biennale, more recently Yokohama. A very warm welcome to Tino Sehgal.
Oh, I don't see people.
Tino, my first question is, I wanted to ask you, when we send you an email and called you concerning the Manifesto Marathon, and this idea that manifestos have played such a big role in the historic avant-gardes of the 20th century and then in the neo-avant-gardes of the 60s, 70s again, this idea of revisiting today manifestos, you suggested immediately, actually, that this could not be a manifesto presentation, but more conversation. Could you explain why?
Well, there are many reasons. I mean, one was that I thought you should work too. And then, maybe one of the other reasons is that I have no wish to make a kind of very, in my view, male declaration of my intents. I think that's something which is very 20th century, kind of to have this kind of male confidence and kind of, you know, modernist belief in the future and what will happen in the future, and to kind of lay it down. And I just felt not really comfortable with that format, and I'm never comfortable with this kind of theatrical setting, which I, you know, disagree with in my work. So I thought, you know, the 21st century will be hopefully more like a dialogue, more like a conversation, and maybe that in itself is a kind of manifestation or whatever, but I'm really even careful to use that word. I just think that, you know, the 20th century was kind of so sure of itself, and I hope that the 21st century will be less sure of itself. And I think it will be, and part of that is, you know, to listen to what other people say and to enter a dialogue and not to stand up and kind of declare one's intent. There's something weirdly retrograde about that.
Does this have to do with doubt also? Because obviously manifestos usually don't have so much to do with doubt. And in '99, when we worked on Laboratorium, Carsten Höller founded a laboratory for doubt, and he wanted to create a movement to inject doubt into society.
No, I don't think it has something to do with doubt. I think it has more something to do with a sensibility for complexity. I think that there's a kind of Newtonian sensibility towards the world still in the 20th century, and I think we don't have this, I hope we don't have the sensibility anymore, that we have a sensibility for how complex processes are, and that, you know, it's better to engage in them together than to kind of pretend one has a vision. That doesn't mean to, like, in a kind of postmodernist sense, to humble down.
Now, some other aspects we discussed is, I mean, we live in a time that is more atomized and has maybe less cohesive artistic movements. I mean, manifestos have very often been related to movements. I think you had something to say on that?
No, okay, so I had 2 thoughts about this event. I mean, one I just said is that I thought, well, the idea of, you know, bringing back the idea of the manifesto is kind of retrograde, no? But on the other hand, I found it quite amusing that, you know, you, a curator, was inviting artists to give a manifesto. That's so 21st century somehow. It's so dialogical, no? Because imagine, like, some museum director telling the Dadaist, now come on, get your manifesto down. So in that sense, the event has something, you know, kind of sympathetic. And well, the other thing that I was interested in is definitely, okay, why not try and extrapolate what the 21st century could be? No? And I, like many other people, I have some vague ideas about that, and I don't think they're very worked out, but maybe it's kind of 21st century to even say them, even though they're not completely worked out, and the 21st century is not so old either. But I think that maybe one of the differences, I think, is that there's a certain kind of vulgarity about the 20th century. How can I explain this? It's kind of relates to what I said before, but this kind of confidence and kind of loudness. It doesn't have a kind of aristocratic elegance. It has this kind of teenage vulgarity, kind of like shouting out, this is what we're going to do, we're against that, and then kind of naivete in that as well. And I hope the 21st century won't have that anymore, because I kind of don't think it's that interesting.
Can you talk more about this? Does it mean the aristocratic to bring that back, but I mean in a different way? Is it repetition and difference? Or?
No, I mean that's... let's leave the aristocratic out, and then I'll speak about that later maybe, because that's, I think, a point I have to explain a bit longer.
Yeah.
But I'll come back to it. But let's use the words vulgar and elegant, no? Yeah, more kind of relates back to what I said before, kind of a sensibility for the kind of complexity, but also the difficulty of life, and that you just can't barge in and say, now we're going to make everything different. There was a kind of attitude, especially in art, let's say in the first part of the 20th century, which is kind of loud, and then I think another difference, which I think is happening on different levels, and I hope that I'm part of it, that art in the 20th century very much dealt with the idea of producing a kind of outside. So there was like economy, society, and then we produced this outside. I mean, these are all very common things. And nonetheless, in my view, all the avant-gardes were fueled by this conception, and also by this wish to somehow make a work of art which is outside of society, which is outside of basically the commodity form, as they would call it. And I think that's just a very kind of misguided and naive idea, as I've said before, because anything can be a product. If you now give me £1,000 to say loads of bullshit here, that can be a product. And maybe I will not, but only if I accept. So anything can be a product. The idea to kind of try not to make a product or commodity is a kind of dead end, but I think that it was a productive dead end. I mean, I'm not at all against the avant-garde. I'm just saying, what do we maybe not want to keep from them? And it was productive, but also a bit loud and simplistic and vulgar somehow. And so I think that obviously such an outside of the commodity form in general cannot exist. So like the 20th century was fueled by these if questions, like is what I'm doing a product or not? And I think the 21st century will hopefully be more guided by how questions. So how am I'm a product, or how am I doing, how am I relating to you now, or to these people here, whatever? And what is the ethics implied in this, and not in this kind of general statement, which is kind of, as I've said now 3 times, simplistic.
Great, so maybe I think it would anyway be nice to open it to the floor, because it's a moment also maybe to have questions. But before we do that, I would be very curious to know more about your intriguing idea about aristocracy, the thing which is going to take longer. I want to hear the thing which is going to take longer. This
is going to take longer, so you have to bear with me, and if you don't understand it, then just shout. Okay, so this is a very rough idea, and it's not at all worked out, and I haven't really tried it out on anybody, so kind of throwing myself into the insecurities of the 21st century. So, but in my view, so we have something like the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. Before that, we have a feudal system. Everybody knows that. And so, what are the characteristics of this kind of, class system with aristocracy? And the other classes is that aristocracy is exempt from labor, and the others are basically producing. And then, aristocracy is taking care of some governing functions, but basically has a lot of time to spend. And what does it spend this time on? And this kind of refinement of its attitudes, manners, the art of conversation, the art of living. And why does it do that? Okay, because A, it has the time, but B, as Thorstein Veblen famously, showed, because it also has to demonstrate its kind of position of richness and superiority by all the time it can waste on, for example, constructing its way of speaking. So if you can recognize an aristocrat by the way he or she speaks, because he has spent loads of time on refining this manner of speaking. So this system and this kind of cultural refinement that aristocracy has, was brought up was related to the self. It was about a construction of self, but it was obviously deeply undemocratic thing and it was built upon also kind of exploitation of the other classes. So then what happens with the French and the Industrial Revolution is that we have a movement where this inequality, this injustice is kind of broken down, and we come into more like democratic and especially mass cultural societies. And I think that's also where visual art in the museum comes in. So now the new leading class, the bourgeoisie, does not have the time, because it's not exploiting other classes. It does not have the time to spend so much time on refining itself, because it's still working. And but obviously they're also still interested in a refinement. And so how do they do that? They do it via taking possession of the world, via the objects they acquire, which also obviously makes a link to their, daily work life, is that they generate income and then they can spend this income. So it's also a kind of mirror of the income they have generated. And so subjectivity and aesthetics and all these things which were more related to the self and aristocracy now, in a bourgeois mass culture, now become more related to the object. Yeah? And that's also when museums are created and the culture we're all in now, where we go around museums and look at things, which is such a strange, peculiar exception in the history of mankind. I mean, there's no ritual we can think of in other societies which relates to people looking at things and not people doing things. And obviously, I mean, as many museum studies people have shown, the museum is a ritual. It's a ritual we go to in a way to shape ourselves. And so first we had, let's say, pre-industrial society. We had the kind of unjust but aesthetically refined parts of society, and then we had a more, let's say, democratized, just, but kind of mass cultural society. And I think that also, I mean, this is a side point, but I think that's what a lot of cultural critics of the 20th century, maybe also in the beginning of the 20th century react to. They still have an aristocratic sensibility. Like somebody like Adorno, I think he has an aristocratic sensibility, and he's shocked that this sensibility is somehow disappearing into mass culture. And I think my view, and what I think is interesting for the 21st century, is now to bring the kind of level of refinement. That doesn't mean their particular aesthetics. I'm not saying that we should walk around like at the court of Versailles, but the court of Versailles, in a very situationist sense, is a place full of constructed situations. No? And so this level of refinement to bring, and this level of also taking care of the self and of refining the self, of constructing the self, and not necessarily this focus onto the object. Yeah? That the 21st century will hopefully be about bringing these lost elements back on a mass level. No? And that's I think what the task. That's in my view. I don't know if it's clear what I said, but anyway, I tried. And so that's my idea what the 21st century is going to be about.
I think that's a great moment to open it up to the floor. Any urgent questions for Tino?
Are we done?
See a question here, yeah. Sarah?
What you said is very interesting, but it's almost dialectically the other of what Boris Groys said in his talk in the Frieze Arts Fair, where he was talking about the designed self and how the artist has disappeared because everybody is self-designed, and only the gaping chasm of catastrophe.
What, the last sentence?
I said only a gaping chasm of catastrophe can signal the emergence of the real with a capital R. So, I mean, on the one hand, we have neo-aristocrats constructing a more aristocratic and sensitive self. The antithesis to that is the mass self-designed 21st century creature who actually has no inner self. You are positing the existence of an inner self which can be constructively aristocratized. Boris Groys was talking about surface and the designed self and a kind of lack of an inner reality. Both of you projecting these self-constructed creatures into the 21st century. I just wanted to put those two things against each other, because both of them have come up by, you know, in terms of similar thought patterns, but in the last 2 or 3 days. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, obviously, I don't know. I mean, I'm familiar with Boris Groys' work, and I agree with you know, numerous of his points, not with all of them, but I'm not familiar with this point, so I'm not sure I understood what you said, but I definitely didn't talk about inner self. I talked more about, like, in a Foucauldian sense, about, like, technologies of the self, like working on the self through exercise and through repetition, basically. And that's what more I'm thinking of, and that's also what, let's say, you know, obviously the word aristocracy is a bit provocative, and I don't think you need to go with all the connotations. The interesting thing about the aristocrats is that they took a lot of time, and that they were not so focused on labor. Of course, we know why they could, but I think this is also an interesting element for us. I mean, we are completely embedded in this Protestant work ethic, and the question is how much we actually need to be embedded in this work ethic, and how, if we cannot try to also, I'm thinking about an economic level, relax a little bit. I'm not, you know, I have a background in economics, but I'm far from being, you know, an economist. But I think it would be interesting for an economist to figure out, like, how much we could also bring down economic activity. And especially in London, it seems a place where, you know, the kind of industrial society of model of, you know, working, generating income, consuming seems to be very striving. But I don't think that it's going to be a model which is going to be very sustainable, both in a kind of, you know, ecological and in a psychological sense. No? And I think, like, there's very interesting movements of people, of course, in privileged positions who are, like, downsizing, saying, why should I work a lot than to be able to consume my leisure? Why don't I just, you know, involve in activities which don't even need money? No? And definitely, I mean, as I don't know Boris Groys' point, I'm not sure, you know, if I'm reacting to what you said, but I mean, definitely there's a critique which has been made of, like, Foucault's idea of technologies of the self from the left, which is saying basically today we are forced by, you know, market forces to kind of design ourselves. And I again think this is an if question. I'm not saying that such a leftist critique is wrong. I think that definitely can exist, that people feel this pressure to be creative, to kind of have a personality, but it's, again, it's more a how question of, like, well, okay, what are the ethics involved in creating myself, and how do I create myself, and how do I also expect the creation, like the other's creation of him or herself, no? I don't know if I answered your question, but I didn't.
Is there any other urgent question for Tino? I have a question here.
You described the 20th century as being a confidence century. And you compared that to the 21st century as being one of more conversation and as, you know, being more fragmented. I didn't really understand what you meant. I'd like you to. I mean, I didn't really understand what you meant by saying that the 20th century is a confidence century. I wonder if you could elaborate.
Well, I think especially in art. I mean, especially in art, it was a very male century of, like. A lot of avant-gardes, at least in my feeling, come with this attitude of, this is it, and this is what it's going to be. And if you think, of course, it waters down the longer the 20th century goes. I think, like, it's strongest in something like futurism, basically say this is what the future is going to be. No?
Yeah, it's actually the centenary next year, 1909, of the
And I think
Manifesto.
the 20th century ends basically with the generation before mine, with the 90s, which have no, like, with the generation of artists before me, which have no intent whatsoever to make big declarations. No, that doesn't mean that. But the interesting thing about the generation before mine is also that they don't. It doesn't mean that they're not ambitious. I think that they are quite ambitious, but they never say these ambitions in a very big declaratory sense. So they are kind of. That doesn't mean that they're not confident, but they don't display their confidence in such a maybe slightly vulgar way. Does that make it clear to you?
But it's actually
it comes also from this manifesto thing, because of course to say 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, and that's an act of confidence.
But it's interesting because it actually leads to a question I wanted to ask you before, which is also, I mean, manifestos had often to do also with a rupture to previous kind of generations. And it was the question really about how you connect to kind of art practices of the 90s, and particularly if you think about, you know, liberating time and this whole issue about time. You mentioned, I mean, Pierre Week founded the Association du Temps Libéré, the Association of Liberated Time. So I was somehow wondering how you connected somehow to this idea of how the previous generation to you dealt with time.
Yeah, I think that also, let's say, the 20th century or the beginning of the 20th century, and this relates back to your question, you know, is very modernist. And what does modernism mean? It means to create, you know, as I think Bruno Latour, your old friend, has said, you know, it means to create two distinct kind of times. You know, modernism or a modernist attitude creates always a past which is kind of inferior. No? And this is what a manifesto always, you know, this is what you just said, basically, no? You said it wants to make a rupture. That's what Hans-Ulrich said. And this idea of a rupture is a very modernist, and as we know from, I think, people like Latour have shown very clearly, it's a very simplest conception of how the world works. And a more contemporary notion would be, yeah, something like Hans-Ulrich said in the beginning, like of difference and tradition, and I think that's probably the biggest achievement of postmodernism, in my view, would be that they brought in the importance of tradition. No? So for me, obviously, to come to your question, I mean, the generations before me are very important. Also, if I'm today, you know, making, you know, all these comments about like how the avant-gardes are vulgar, but of course, I deeply built on their achievements, and I also built on the achievements of the generation before me, and I'm very much interested in their. I think that they really brought installation to the foreground. The 90s generation, or whatever we want to call them, the generation before mine is the one which really, truly starts working on installations, not more. And I think for me that's a very important point of departure.
You can take one last question. I have a question here.
I just want to take up this point about the aristocracy and link it to Alain Badiou's 15 Theses on Contemporary Art, because one of his theses, he says the only maxim for art is that the artist mustn't be imperial, but he then goes on and makes this point
Art must be what?
The artist must not be imperial, but he goes on and says, he makes this anti-democratic point, and he links it to aristocracy. He goes, he makes the point that you do, that...
no, he doesn't. Me and Badiou not in one boat.
Well, this is, he does actually, that's why I wanted to know whether you are in the same...
No, no, because that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not interested in the anti-democratic elements, but I think that there's some of the achievements of the aristocracy, you know, which have to do with this technologies of the self, or working on the self, refinement of the self, working on a personality, which exactly because they were founded on, you know, an anti-democratic structure, they have been kind of pushed away. But I think now that we are truly, you know, we are a mass culture, we are very, you know, we are democratic societies for, you know, decades and centuries. I think we can afford to look, okay, is there maybe not something interesting there? And on the other hand, okay, I don't want to, I know that it's a bit provocative metaphor, and I'm kind of trying it out to you, maybe out on you, maybe I'm not going to use it again, because there's so many other connotations with aristocracy, which is, on the one hand, makes it slightly spectacular, but on the other hand, maybe also easy to misinterpret.
Great. So I have one last question, because whenever we speak with Tino, I always ask him one last question at the end, so I shall do as well today, which is if you could tell us about your unrealized project. Is there a project which has been too big to be realized, too small to be realized? The unbuilt roads of Tino Sehgal.
Okay, so you always ask this question. At first I thought I'm not going to answer this question, but then I thought, well, wait. Because, okay, on Thursday, this is really maybe not so interesting, but it has something to do with my personal life at the moment. On Thursday I was in Zurich, and they told me that if my work was be shown, the AXA insurance would not insure the rest of the show. So it's unrealized. Yeah, and I've never shown this work before, and so that's a
Okay, how did this happen?
So the insurance just heard about my work, and they said, if this work will be shown, we will not insure the rest of the show.
And which work is it?
Well, it's not been realized, so I'm not sure if I'm going to say its title. I'm not sure about its title either, because it's a kind of old, new work. Huh? No. I'm very interested in art, you know. I am interested in art. And I hope that they have been very lucky to have shown a lot in London, but I hope to show more, and I hope that you will see it one day when it gets realized. Yeah.
Many, many thanks, Tino Sehgal. Thank you so much. Vielen Dank.
Kann man die unterhalten, meinst du?